Hey everyone, welcome back to another installment of Built by Us, the video series. If you've heard of Built by Us before, that's because it spawned from our podcast series, Built by Us. So be sure to tune in on anywhere you listen to your podcasts, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. But thank you for tuning in today. Today we're going to be talking about unaffiliated voters in North Carolina as we head and barrel right into the general election on November 5th. I've got a special guest with me today, Brian Kennedy, who's our Senior Policy Analyst. Oh, also, my name is Joselle Torres. Thank y'all for being here. So Brian is our researcher and cook is a researcher and a cook, not our cook, although I would love to eat some of your amazing food. He's based in Durham, North Carolina, and he combines social science and culture work to explore problems and understand and preserve the legacy of Afro-Carolina. He's a graduate of NCCU, Go Eagles, in history and political science, and has a master's in public policy from the Heller School at Brandeis University. He works as our senior policy analyst, but has done that role for many orgs in North Carolina. So Brian, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Joselle.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this work.
So I am originally from North Carolina. I grew up in North Carolina and Virginia. And was the child of teachers. Grandparents were teachers and nurses, and so knew I wanted to be involved somehow in change work. So I've been working in the nonprofit policy space for about 10 or 12 years now, and so I think there's nothing more important than making sure our democracy runs. So I'm really grateful to be here with Democracy in North Carolina doing this work.
That's amazing. And tell us a little bit about the research that you do for North Carolina and the policy analysis.
Yeah, so, a lot of what we do are, trying to understand trends of voters, but also trying to keep track of and understand changes in election laws, not just at the state level, but also at the local level. We do a lot of monitoring to understand exactly what's happening at the county level, especially in regards to the County Board of Elections. So that's where a lot of our data comes from, is from our amazing volunteers and network that does the data collection and monitors and reports back to us, as well as our organizing team at Democracy North Carolina. So, a lot of our research is around understanding, the challenges that voters are having, as well as trying to understand what they want democracy to look like and how we can make sure that our state policy reflects the version and the vision of democracy that North Carolinians want.
Yeah, and I think one of the trends that have emerged, and the reason why we're chatting today, is that in 2022, for those elections, for the first time ever, unaffiliated voters surpassed registered Republican and Democrat voters. So can you tell us a little bit about who or what an affiliated voter is?
Yeah, so an unaffiliated voter is someone who, when they're filling out their voter registration form, they decide they don't want to affiliate with one of the two major political parties, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And we talked about this a little bit before, but I myself am an unaffiliated voter. And when I remember registering to vote in North Carolina when I was a student at NCCU, and thinking like, oh, unaffiliated? I didn't know that was an option. I think the other thing that's really unique about North Carolina, that option was added in 1977, but a decade later in 87, a law was changed so that unaffiliated voters could actually vote with any political party in the primary.
Wow.
And so what that meant was that there were no longer kind of downsides or restrictions to choosing to vote or to register, as unaffiliated. So from that time up until 1996, when the Democratic Party allowed unaffiliated voters to vote in their primaries, the number of unaffiliated voters just really skyrocketed up until 2022, like you said, when the number of voters who actually register as unaffiliated became the largest quote unquote party in the state.
What do you think motivates folks to register as an unaffiliated voter?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I can speak for myself personally. When I first came to the state and registered to vote, I was really excited about the option of having the ability to choose a primary based upon the issues that I was most interested in. I think more so than anything, one thing that was just really appealing about North Carolina's system in particular was that registering as an unaffiliated voter does not preclude you from participating in the primary election. So
Awesome.
that's something that a few other states do, but it was an intentional decision made in North Carolina in order to give unaffiliated voters the ability to hop from one primary or from one candidate to another. More recently, though, a lot of polling out of Meredith has actually started to give us a little bit of an idea of why people are registering as unaffiliated. Overwhelmingly, unaffiliated voters report being disappointed or having a lack of confidence in the two-party system. When asked questions like, when asked questions like, do you think that either political party cares about people, quote unquote, like you? A majority of folk who are registered as unaffiliated say no. When asked, do you think that a two-party system is the best way for democracy to run? A large majority of unaffiliated voters say no. So those are some commonalities. Commonalities that we found amongst those voters is that they don't have a lot of faith in this two-party system, and they want more options. I think another thing that's really interesting, though, is that a majority of unaffiliated voters in this, I think, polling that happened earlier this year said that they believed that the United States was more divided than ever before. And that was actually higher than both Republicans and Democrats who were taking part of the polling. What was interesting, though, was that when asked, do you believe over the next 5 years the U.S. will be more or less divided, unaffiliated voters were more likely than Democrats or Republicans to say that they were hopeful that the U.S. would be less divided. So you can take that with a grain of salt, whatever division means to you. But what it means to me is that this group of voters are complex, that they may appear to be pessimistic, or they may come off as heavily critical of the current system,
which is valid.
which is a part of democracy. I think what's really intriguing and what really sparked my mind, and we don't have the answers to understand completely why just yet, but those folk were, and I say those folk, but I include myself, were extremely hopeful, and they believed in a democratic system, and they have very strong feelings on what makes a democratic system work better.
Yeah, and I think when you're choosing unaffiliated, you're choosing not to participate as a Republican or Democrat. So I can see how that could kind of correlate down with being hopeful for people uniting and coming together. What do you think motivates those folks to actually get to the polls?
I think, and this is me speculating, but I mean, I think that folk who make an intentional decision, again, unaffiliated voters encompass a large swath of people, and so just making generalized observations. Valid. But I think that when people are sitting there registering to vote, it is because of what we kind of how we interact with the media, and most media coverage is on the two political party system. I think it's easy to choose one political party or the other. I think a lot of unaffiliated voters are kind of being thoughtful in that process. And so those are folk who are probably highly motivated to go out and participate and vote.
I mean, this is a tough topic to talk about because unaffiliated voters, like you said, aren't subscribing, quote unquote, to the traditional two-party system because they're fed up with it. And that is so valid. Right now, we have a broken political system. We see that here in North Carolina with the supermajority at the North Carolina General Assembly, where they're having budgets passed behind closed doors in the middle of the night. We have racial gerrymandering that's done with surgical precision. We have voter ID laws and restrictions. And so when we look at the general two-party system and how it's worked for us up until this point, I could certainly empathize and understand why a person says, I'm not going to participate in that. I'm going to choose unaffiliated to hopefully start something different. So yeah, we look at the North Carolina state legislature and we see the supermajority that is in power right now performing and closing deals behind closed doors in the middle of the night, attaching budgets to bills that have nothing to do with budgets. We know that the unaffiliated voter is choosing not to participate in this two-party system of Republican or Democrat, and they're choosing that to build and hopefully create something different.
Yes, absolutely. I think you make an excellent point about different forms of democracy and the different ways that people participate in democracy. And people can vote actively by for example, registering with one party, doing work on behalf of that one party. People also vote passively by choosing not to be a participant in a particular system. One finding that was interesting out of this report was feelings, not just feelings of unaffiliated voters regarding a third party candidate, but their actions as well. So a majority of the polling said that unaffiliated voters are very much in favor of a third party or additional parties, or expanding the two-party system. But a majority of these unaffiliated voters voted for one of the two major party candidates. They didn't vote for a third party candidate. And there's lots of reasons why that might be, but I think some fair things might be the fact that it's very hard for a third party candidate to win. From the funding structures that are embedded with the major party systems.
We all know that Citizens United changed the way that money fuels our elections.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, Citizens United has a huge impact. I think all the different, and I think that if there are some trends that we can assume, it's that folk are pretty tired of their democracy being messed with. They want the ability to choose freely. Folk don't feel like they have that ability to choose freely. And so I think people are using whatever tools they have available to them to express that. Another huge example, I think, was the Democratic primary on March 5th this year. And so if you might remember, there was a huge movement to vote uncommitted.
That's right.
In North Carolina, 13% of the Democratic primary went to uncommitted voters.
It's huge.
Which is huge. And when you compare it to other southern states, much bigger. So much bigger than the uncommitted vote in Tennessee, much bigger than the uncommitted vote in Alabama. I think we were right at the same level as uncommitted voters in Michigan, another huge swing state. And so that was a really popular movement, and a lot of folk, including myself, would argue that there was a very effective messaging in that vote as well. And so voting
because it was something different.
Yes, because it was something different, because there was a clear articulation of why this vote is necessary, of the critique of the major party. So I think that voice is being, or that opinion is being stated up and down across the state in different ways throughout the primary, and we'll probably see it again in the general, just in terms of folk registering, unaffiliated voters voting. But I think people want better. They want more options. They want a functional democracy.
Like literally the bare minimum, y'all.
Like people are not asking for much. And so I think that's exactly why we see the unaffiliated group just growing tremendously.
And is there like a certain age range or something like that where we're seeing this growth happen?
Yes. So there are some interesting trends and non-trends. I think when talking about
let's get geeky, let's get in it.
So I like to start geographically. So one thing our report looks at is just where unaffiliated voters spread out throughout the state.
Unaffiliated, yes.
So we find that we have there are counties in the West, in the East, and in the Piedmont with extremely high unaffiliated voting, registered unaffiliated voters. Watauga County, Polk County out west, Wake County, Orange County in the Triangle.
Those are huge counties.
Onslow, New Hanover in the east. And so these are urban. These are counties with quote unquote urban, or with cities attached to them, but also counties that are completely rural. So it's if we were to call it a movement, the unaffiliated movement is spread throughout the state. It is typically younger. So almost 50% of voters under the age of 25 are registered as uncommitted.
That's impressive.
That number goes down with each age bracket. So by the time you get to voters who are 66 and above, I think it's still over a quarter of those voters are actually registered as unaffiliated. Which means a couple of things. It means if there are younger voters who are registering as unaffiliated, this is from the time that they've registered, this has always been an option.
Always been there, yeah.
With older voters, for a majority of many of their voting career or voting lifetime or
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it, that has not been an option. And so I think 26%, while not nearly as high as the 50% of younger voters, that's a lot of folk who are actively making a decision
Yeah.
to not associate with one of the two major political parties.
Yeah.
I think similarly, we see some trends with race and ethnicity as well.
Sure.
So I think Asian American voters are most likely to register as unaffiliated. Black voters are actually least likely. So only 22% of Black voters are registered as unaffiliated. And when it comes to ethnicity, a majority, at least in 2022, a majority of white voters registered as Republican, a majority of Black voters registered as Democrat, and 44% of Hispanic voters registered as unaffiliated. And it was the largest political group for Hispanic voters in North Carolina. So what that tells me is that there are a lot of things going on. It tells me that there probably isn't one ideal unaffiliated voter.
Sure.
It tells me that a lot of unaffiliated voters care about the same things that you or me care about. That they have very strong feelings about democracy and about like how their government represents them.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think there's a lot that we're still learning about exactly who constitutes this group and exactly what they're looking for and what they want.
Do you think, so as we gear up, and well, when I gear up, we're in it, we're like in the thick of it right now with the general election. We Democracy North Carolina, we work across the state in all 100 counties. And at this time, particularly, well, not just this time, North Carolina seems to get the spotlight a lot, for better or for worse.
Mm-hmm.
And when we have national groups coming in or like national news outlets coming in, they want to know about these unaffiliated voters. Like, how are they going to vote? How are they going to turn out? What are they thinking? And do you think also, this is something I was thinking about, people are choosing unaffiliated so they don't get that knock on the door, so they don't get that like data point to a particular special interest or corporate interest?
I think that's fair. I think there's probably a correlation between like rise in the internet and social media and people having control over their information. I mean, when it comes to democracy and ensuring that you have a voice, your data is extremely important.
Absolutely.
It is valuable. And so I think that there certainly probably is an element of voters wanting to protect that like really valuable thing, which is their data, or even their potential leaning, whatever that may be. I think also it's just I think it just may be a manifestation of a growing feeling that there are things that are more important than personalities.
Facts.
And I think people are tired of our politics being more about personalities and less about actual policy and issues. I think
that's like a tagline: policy over personality.
Yeah, I think I know that there's tons of polling that demonstrate people's feelings towards media, especially over the past 2 election cycles. I think folk in general have started disengaging in a lot of ways. And so I think you're probably right in that the choice to register as unaffiliated, if not in a very meaningful way, prevents people from getting robocalls or whatever it may be. At the very least, I think it gives them some sense of control. And I say them, I'm talking about me as well, right?
Yeah.
Like it does give some sense of control of being able to just have a little bit more of an opportunity to express either your discommitment or your disillusionment or whatever it may be.
Do you think there are ways for, here in North Carolina, for the State Board of Elections to support unaffiliated voters a bit more?
Absolutely. So, I think one of the biggest ways right now, there's a lawsuit contesting the fact that if you're an unaffiliated voter, you don't have representation on the State Board of Elections, right? So all the members on the State Board of Election are either one of the two major political parties, and so that there's currently an effort to try to make sure that there's more representation in that regard.
And that would make sense with
Mhm.
unaffiliated voters being now the largest voting
Absolutely,
bloc.
absolutely. And I think there's probably a shift just in thinking about who's making up unaffiliated voters, a shift from, oh, these are folk who are kind of just like, they're not really that interested in politics, or these are folk uh, who just didn't pay enough attention to
Yeah.
choose one political party or the other, or these are just a hodgepodge of folk from different places with different ideas and different reasons, and they're all mad for different reasons, but they're actually mad for some very similar reasons.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think to that point, like there's certainly there certainly is a need for greater representation. I think the polling shows us that there's a great need for greater representation. I think people are voting with their registration, right, by choosing to be unaffiliated, and I think that's certainly an indication that folk want some better or more representation.
That's great. And I think maybe just my last question would be, what do you think the turnout for unaffiliated voters is going to look like this election cycle?
So during the primary, unaffiliated voters had the lowest rate or had lower rates of turnout compared to Democrats and Republicans. But that's the difference between a primary where there is no unaffiliated primary.
Yeah.
You have to choose one of the two major primaries, and the difference between that and the general election. So I don't know. I won't get. I would hesitate to predict. I would expect that unaffiliated voter turnout would be relatively high. I think I've noticed this election cycle, and I'll say, like, I've been through a couple of presidential election cycles at this point, and from my just anecdotal experience or whatever, I think that there's been more conversation this come around about the inadequacy of the two parties.
Yeah. Yes.
And we can go on for days and talking about
Yes.
like what has led to that critique.
Yes.
But I do think, if the trend continues in terms of how folk are registering, I do think we're going to see a relatively large turnout for unaffiliated voters. When it comes to local down ballot races, I think that folk feel a little bit more able to get in touch with, are just a little bit more relatable to these candidates. So, whether they're registering as Republican or Democratic, I think is a little bit less of a gap because they're actually in community with these folks.
Yeah.
I think it's when we're getting to the top of the ballot that folk really do feel disconnected from the major political parties. And so, for that reason, I think it would be interesting to see what happens if this trend or this movement of unaffiliated voters continues to rise.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point about like the way it matters up the ballot, because even down ballot races, like back in the day, used to be nonpartisan, and now some of those like school board races are becoming partisan races, and you wonder why. And is it because the two-party function and system wants it to be that way?
I think any conversation about unaffiliated voters has to touch on the reasons why folk are choosing to do this, but also I think it also has to touch on the what we assume to be normal or typical functionings of our two-party system.
Yeah.
I think elections funding is an extremely huge part of that.
Yeah. Yes.
A lot of the conversation around the third-party candidates in North Carolina has been around that idea of like a spoiler vote.
Yeah.
And so we've seen a lot of criticism from both political parties about why third-party candidates should or should not be able to be on the ballot. And we've seen efforts, right, to control how folk are added to the ballot.
On the ballot, off the ballot, on the ballot, off the ballot.
Right. It's been a seesaw. And so, I think that is reflective of people wanting something different.
Yeah.
And I think that the urgency with which parties have attempted to maintain status quo is likely an indication of how important it is for funding mechanisms, media mechanisms to maintain the same, so that parties are able to retain their market share or retain control.
Yeah.
So I think we've got a really structured and a really old way of electing candidates,
Yeah.
and the powers that be, whoever, I think that there's natural resistance to that.
Yeah.
Which is not, not surprising. Power attempts to stay in power.
Yes.
But I think what we're seeing is that people are voting a little bit differently.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today and sharing the information that you provided. If you're looking for more of this information about unaffiliated voters, Democracy North Carolina is releasing a report specifically about everything we've talked about and more today. Brian, one of the co-authors, alongside other folks here at Democracy North Carolina and in partnership with us in Coalition, worked hard to kind of comb and source and find all this information for us so we can be informed and learn about this growing, well, now the largest voting bloc here in North Carolina. If you're not registered to vote, you have up to October 11th to register to vote, or you can go to any early voting location starting October 17th and do same-day registration. You can register as unaffiliated or however you choose, but make sure you're registered to vote, and we'll see you out there at the polling locations. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon.